Okay, good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to Resilience and Reimagining Resolution, where emotional intelligence meets trauma-informed facilitation. My name is Taisha Preston, and I am the Administrative Assistant for SCMA. This event is in meeting format, which means you can hear and see us, and we can hear and see you. So we ask that you stay muted throughout the entire workshop. If you are requiring MCLE credit for this workshop, please make sure that your name that appears in the Zoom account is the name that matches the state bar or your state bar number. If you did not provide us with your state bar number, please send me a chat or email me at info@scmediation.org. Lastly, this event is being recorded. You will receive a link to all the workshops from the conference along with the certificate of attendance for those workshops that qualify for MCLE in the next 7 to 10 business days. If you have any questions regarding the event, please feel free to send me a chat. And now we'll hear from Wendy Macy.
Thank you, Taisha, and thank you for managing that tongue twister of a title. We have a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation today from Lydia Liberio. And so it's my honor to introduce her. She has a very impressive background. She's currently the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Academic Success at Abraham Lincoln University. She's also an experienced attorney, mediator, arbitrator, and professor, and she has an LLM in Alternative Dispute Resolution from the USC Gould School of Law. So she does do a lot of teaching with law students, and so she does welcome your questions. Taisha and I are going to be monitoring the chat, and so halfway through, at a convenient break, we're happy to take questions. She's a very engaging speaker and has a lot of content to present. So without further ado, I'll let Dean Liberio get rolling.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm really excited. I see a lot of familiar faces, some of whom are involved in my education in ADR, including Professor Pollock. And also I remember working with Marvin during my clinical period with Drew and Stacy. I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can get the screen share going. Can folks see it? I hope.
You're all good. We can see the screen.
Great. Let me see if I can make it just a little bigger. So it's less of an eye strain. So my background actually was in criminology before law school. So I've always been intrigued by a number of these topics. And there are some things that we're going to look at very quickly. But I'm a person that likes to be very comprehensive. So in case people are more curious about the rest of a model or its context, it's on the slides, which are they're available to you. So I want to touch briefly on diversity as an access point to emotional and social intelligence, and also give you a little bit of insight into the Strengths Development Inventory personality types. And then we'll layer what happens when people are dealing with extra trauma like pandemics and how that impacts high conflict people. And then we'll close out with some strategies as to how we can deal with that in the transition to ODR and beating Zoom fatigue and being resilient in general. So that's sort of the structure. And so I'm sure many of you are very familiar with diversity, and really a lot of it relates to identity and traits, and also how we see the world. And inclusiveness is empowering people and engaging them. And when we're in a mediation, we need to be aware of the different grounds of diversity people have, including our own outlooks on things. And we're usually trying to be inclusive so we can help the parties move forward. I remember that Drew would always say at the Children's Court Mediation Center, that we are sort of on the side of the settlement or the solution. That's really our piece of the puzzle, because we're neutral, we're not taking a side, but we're the promoter of the process itself in a sense. And so I'm gonna pick on one of these. You can see some of them are very traditional in the center and some are more creative on the exterior. It includes our thinking styles, our communication styles, but I'm gonna pick on age just for a moment. Because it's something we can't necessarily change readily, but it does have some impact on our thinking. This is a different view of diversity where the emphasis is more on the values, and you can see that it adds some additional considerations like community relationships and organizational roles. So we all have relationships within our family. If you're dealing with, family mediation, and if you are in a corporate or employment context, I think a lot of times people's positions or stances are tethered to their official role. Secretly, they may think you have a really valid point or gripe, but as the head of HR or the division chief, they might be sort of in a different position that requires a different perspective for the instant mediation that you're working on. And so this is just kind of fun. I'm Gen X, but I married a boomer. And one thing that is cute is if you look online, you'll see that there are different cutoff points for these too. So it's not hard and fast. I think it's always fun to kind of see where people fit in. And does anybody know what we call the group after Generation Z?
Millennials.
Are they the
We
swipe
call them-
generation?
They call them the alpha generation. Since we got to Z, we have to reboot the alphabet. And so they're also lovingly referred to as screenagers, and hopefully not screenager. But anyway, I digress. Right? So, and I think a lot of it is sort of couched in terms of our geopolitical experiences growing up. Was it a time of prosperity? Were there times of war or other types of uncertainty? And what I kind of find interesting is if you look at the baby boomer focus on collectivism, and you look at the Gen Z focus on communicationaholic, lots of dialoguing and so forth, there's a lot of commonality actually between Gen Z and baby boomers, whereas Gen Xers like myself and Gen Y millennials are sometimes thought to be a little bit more self-oriented. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So, but what is interesting is when you're mediating with people, they've got all these influences. There's a fun study that came out almost 20 years ago about generations collide, and I'll contrast that with a 1-year-old study so you can see how much there's been a shift on how just one single element of diversity can change optically speaking. And so I think the key here is that diversity itself is in flux, all the categories, what's considered, and within a category. So if you're dealing with an employment situation, it's the difference between, do I want to build a legacy or do I need a portable career? Are other people collectively going to help me with a shift in balance at the company, like change rollouts and so forth? Or is work not the center of your universe because you're a millennial and you're worried a little bit more about the work-life balance? And then even issues of training, is it that everyone's got to learn for themselves, or we're all self-training and group training all the time as part of continuous learning? The feedback piece is especially telling. I remember when I was in Big Law, I was a McDermott, and I had a partner that was a little bit impatient, and I worked for all the partners. So this no way gives it away because so many hundreds and thousands of people working there. But we had a young case manager, and she was in her early 20s, and she wanted to be patted on the back for every single deposition preparation binder she completed from that partner. She wanted a lot of feedback, and that partner was peculiarly resistant to feedback more so than anyone I've ever encountered, literally with a do not disturb sign on her door most of the work week, and also on the phone and so forth. And the email, I'm away on the IM system. And the young lady knocked on the door, barged in with the depot binders, even though I had told her, wait until she calls the meeting, you know, the following day we'll present it at that time. She's real busy. And I remember seeing the binders come flying back across the room at the case manager. And so not a good approach. And so it's helpful to keep in mind some of these things in workplaces that we share. Is, you know, job satisfaction because you did the job well, or does it have to be in a field that is uniquely of meaning to the person in the role? These are just different aspects, and also even the perspective of job changes. You might find this kind of intriguing. Even the brands and things that entities think about are a little bit different. And yet you'll notice that if you compare a millennial to a baby boomer, they're still thinking about brands like Apple or things like Amazon. There is some overlap between the two. And then more recent research by McKinsey and also by Deloitte and Touche has suggested that people are not all that different at all. When you look at the big picture things about family having an impact on society, seeing the world, there's almost no difference. So I think the generations are coming closer together. I also wanted to spend a little bit of time covering emotional intelligence. And I know that probably a lot of mediators may have heard of Daniel Goleman's work. And so I want to kind of take it to the next level and just only briefly bounce on emotional intelligence and head straight into social intelligence, which is a paradigm he came up with 20 something years later, about 22 years later. So emotional intelligence focuses on, you know, how we are motivated and how well we sort of self-regulate our emotions, what we're thinking, our thoughts, how self-aware we are, how strong our social skills are, and how well we're able to relate to other people, empathy. And as mediators, we tend to be motivated to help people solve their problems, and we tend to be understanding, and we self-regulate, because sometimes we'll see things in mediation where you're sort of thinking to yourself, okay, I can't believe that person just said that. Okay, stepping away from that, how can we help these people come back together? Because that's the kind of hurtful statement that's going to head these folks towards an impasse that we need to pull them back away from. And I know our previous panel was about, you know, dealing with impasse scenarios, so it kind of segues nicely. And we tend to be very self-aware, especially if we're dealing with multiple mediators in the same set of circumstances, because we need to be aware not only of the parties and their counsel, maybe minors counsel, but we need to make sure that the two of us are on the same page and are working in the same direction, or maybe doing the good cop, bad cop ideas. And so again, as I mentioned, a lot of the content in the slides, you'll have the slides later and you can explore them more fully, but certain areas are more important than others. So within emotional intelligence, these are some of the traits and characteristics that relate to our personal competence and emotional intelligence and our social competence. But I believe that Mr. Goleman quickly realized that few of us operate in a vacuum where we get to deal with only one person at a time. So in reality, most of the time we're in groups, even in a mediation, but in the workplace, with our family, wherever we are. And so what is even more essential than emotional intelligence is social intelligence, which is social awareness added to social facility. It creates your social intelligence. And I promise this is the only math you'll see, I think, for the rest of the session. So what is that all about? If we take a step back. So not all of these features are critical to mediation, but they all are helpful. Receptive listening. I know we all practice that already. I've seen some of us at work. I'm so grateful whenever I see Andy Shelby or Mark Lemke in the room at mediations or wherever we are at the courthouses or DCBA, so I know we're all on that. And I think folks with empathy tend to be accurate, but it is important. It's not just vaguely understanding or being concerned about the other party. It is accurately reading what was that emotion that they just flashed, and then understanding how the social world works and nonverbal emotional signals, the so-called primal empathy. So later on, when I give you some Zoom pointers, you'll realize that that is the biggest challenge we have with Zoom, is the loss of some of the nonverbal aspects and how we process information when we don't get that when we need it. We actually come up with heuristic shortcuts that can create problems for us in mediation. Synchrony, interacting smoothly without words. In an online dispute resolution context or ODR, that's even more challenging, because if people don't have a face showing, we can't see when they're pausing to inhale or leaning in like they might have something to say. And we might inadvertently talk past them. And not every mediation participant is savvy enough to use the emoticon reactions like hand raising, and they may not be, adept or quick typers in the chat box. So it is sort of in a highlighted, more complicated situation than it used to be. Although the nice thing is we can have an effective presentation. We can have a great backdrop that hides, any clutter in the office and so forth. We can choose the details, and we can still express concern. And one thing to consider is when you're using social intelligence, and why it's even more important than emotional intelligence, is because social context change the meaning of a word. We all think we know what yes means. We even have mediation books about getting to, well, yes. But it's important to know that in some cultural contexts, we might simply be saying yes to acknowledge that we heard someone, as opposed to we agree with what they just said. And if someone says yes, and then they follow it with a story whose moral is the opposite of the direction you were traveling, that might actually be yes means no. So I just wanted to sort of alert people to that situation. And so, as promised, I indicated we would be focusing on emotional resilience, which blends everything we've just been talking about into a bigger piece of the pie. And if you look at self-control and adaptability, emotional awareness, social support, and so forth, you see that emotional awareness is very overlapping with emotional intelligence. And you see that social support, control of self, it overlaps with social intelligence. And so they are all very strongly interconnected. So if you're developing these traits, you're actually developing a lot of the skill sets in tandem without even knowing you were doing that, which is a good thing. All right. So one thing we often deal with is we have to deal with different personalities at a mediation. And if you're not familiar with the strengths development inventory, you might find this curious that there are 3 major categories, and there's a lot of cusp areas as well. But the 3 main categories are the nurturing altruistic type, or blues. Often volunteers are blues. I was exposed to this at the Leadership Institute Management Fellows Program for Project Management Institute. And when we all did the survey, it turned out that 90% of the 32 of us were blue, and the rest were greenish hubs, analytic types of folks, and nobody was red, assertive, and directing, which was, I thought, kind of interesting. And so it turns out that personality is related to our conflict management systems in the cycles we go through. When we tense up and fight or flight, we find ourselves in some sort of a conflict. And so this is what that looks like. And I'm only focusing on the first row. If people have a problem with themselves, they're probably in therapy, not a mediation, right? So if they are a blue nurturing type, they're trying to accommodate others. If you're an advocate and your client is doing this and they're getting less than their fair share, then you get stuck trying to figure out how to get to a greater stage of equilibrium. Greens are great in mediation because they're cautious and they want to hear all the facts and positions first. But reds are a little bit more assertive and they rise to the challenge, and everything is about winning. And that's not necessarily great for you as the mediator, because now you've got to deal with all these different factors that you may not have been aware of. I'm kind of curious how many people were familiar with this sort of thought process or system before today. That might be a fun point for the chat box. So when you're dealing with nurturing types, they don't respond well to dismissive, or negative behavior, and they're going to need some time to work through the emotional pieces. And, one thing is they want to affirm the relationship before addressing the issue. So if it's a divorce, there might not be much of a relationship to affirm other than yes, we're going to work together as great co-parents, for the kids' sake and do what we can. But if it's an employment law situation, for example, or a business dispute between two companies, they may have a lot of reasons why they want to keep that relationship going. And this is just a minor hiccup along the way, and so forth. Also note that silence does not necessarily mean they're agreeing to something. They might be processing something. And if you're not sure as a mediator, you might just want to check in with them to make sure that, they're on the same page with you. Now, greens are very analytical, right? And they are big on structure and planning and details. So you might want to get to the next asset on the list of things in a probate dispute or, a divorce process, but they may want to get a little bit more bogged down because they feel comfortable with process. Details are reassuring. They don't like small talk, but as to the nature of the mediation, they'll be focused on the details. If there is too much emotion, they'll get turned off. Not that we have control over the emotional levels of parties in the room, but we can do whatever we can do to try to make sure that the cathartic aspects of a mediation don't overwhelm the logistical concerns and goals of the solutions that the parties might be looking for. They need to focus on, the facilitation and keeping focused on the mediation process itself if they can, after they've had a chance to sort of get through that initial, stance, background information. Now, reds are interesting because they're very emotional at times, yet they hate spending time on emotions. So it's rather a contradiction in terms, which, you're sort of thinking, well, then how do you get around that? What's the solution? And if you are indecisive, they will think that you don't have strength of direction. And yet, you might be in a facilitative mediation where you are not directing. You're trying to help them with the process. Now, you might be in an evaluative mediation where they're actually going to check in and say, what have you seen other parties do to resolve situations like this? What has your experience been? And so forth. But here, they want all the facts and goals, up front. But the problem with that is, as we all know, mediation is a process. And sometimes people are, evolving and getting the content out to you, especially if you're dealing with pro se parties and there aren't written mediation briefs and so forth. It's going to be hard to keep the reds in the room while you're trying to make sure that you've covered everything, just because there's a certain sense of time urgency that can be hard to overcome. I also mentioned that we would be learning a little bit about trauma. And so I know some of our members are actually marriage and family therapists or have organizational psychology backgrounds and so forth. My background comes from criminology, so I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist. I'm sure there are folks that have a lot of additional details, so I'm going to keep it topical and, just sort of the tip of the iceberg. And this is information that I received in terms of the academic ombuds role or hat that I wear 5 days of the week. And so, a lot of my peers are experiencing students that are undergoing a lot of trauma. Law school has always been stressful, can't change that, but the pandemic sort of came out of nowhere for many of us. And so to keep in mind that traumatic events are things that overwhelm our sense of control, connection, and meaning. But as you can see, there's some statistics. The key is that trauma, like the impact of pandemics and greater overwhelming, they reduce parties' emotional regulation, right? And their own sense of comfort. They lose faith in systems, whether it's academics, mediation, the legal system, family relationships, employers, and so forth. All the things we need for them to have self-perception so they can self-regulate and not say some crazy thing that upsets and tips the waiter when 90% of the issues were resolved. And so you just may find some of this helpful to know. Here's some great detail from our government agency that deals with substance abuse and mental health. And you can see how important providing a sense of safety is. Trauma-informed does not mean that you're addressing the trauma. You're not an advisor, you're not a counselor. What you're just trying to do is, as you're processing through things, you're realizing that people could be experiencing the trauma, and you try and recognize and adjust a bit to avoid traumatizing them a second time. So that's the purpose. Wendy, I should probably, as promised, give you a chance, and Taisha as well, if there are any pressing questions. I'll just briefly check in there.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the
oh.
chat. If anyone would like to raise their hand and ask a question, you're more than welcome to.
There'll be plenty of time at the back end as well. And so key things for dealing with trauma: psychological safety, physical safety. That is where online dispute resolution shines, right? People cannot, become too aggressive because they're all in separate locations, and it's easier to ensure everyone is empowered and has a voice, because if people are intimidated or there are restraining orders, etc., all of that is less of an issue. If they're shut in, if they're, in a location where it's hard to access mediation services, they can access it now thanks to the magic of online dispute resolution and some of these diversity issues we spoke about earlier. And Professor Janice Carello adds, for ombuds roles, she adds an additional criteria of resilience, growth, and change. And we've already covered resilience a little bit earlier. The people that we help in mediation, if it's an employment crisis, they may feel like they are, an exile from their workplace. If they're having a health emergency, that may be isolating if they're in a health advocacy program. If it's family law, they may feel like they are a relational exile. So people have unique types of stressors and traumas that are impacting them. And frankly, if you look at the ABA's Pulse report for this past year, nearly half of all lawyers were feeling disengaged from their firms and overwhelmed with family. And for women and folks of diverse backgrounds, it's even more pronounced. And so the advocates in the room, some of our mediators happen to have been attorneys as well, right? And so we're under stress as well. And then there's always the piece of, to the credit of Bill Eddy and Mr. DeStefano, sometimes we're even in situations where we're dealing with high conflict personalities, and they normally overreact with bad behavior, even when there's nothing traumatic going on, like a pandemic. So I include the slide just so you'll know what some of them are. And I love the way Eddy and DeStefano have tied these different high conflict personalities back to a fear of something. Whether it's an inferiority complex driving narcissists or abandonment fears driving borderlines. Imagine what that does if you're in the context of like a family mediation. It's not helpful when the party that never wanted the divorce is also experiencing an abandonment issue in real time, right? So these are all important things to worry about, so just be aware of those. And since we are aware that many people have been rather traumatized by the pandemic, Ken Cloak has got some great information about mediating through both fear and grief, because for some of us, that's what COVID has triggered. People don't know what's going to happen next. You know, travel plans keep changing because of vaccine policies and international policies. People may have lost family members. They may have been furloughed. They may be afraid of the consequences of a bad reaction to a vaccine. They may be afraid of being around people that don't want to take a vaccine. There's a lot going on. And so one great thing about online dispute resolution is you don't have to worry about whether they've been vaccinated or not, because they're somewhere else and you are in a safe place and they are in safe places. I guess for advocates, it's the highest risk if your client is with you at your office, which I kind of actually recommend for online dispute resolution, because I've been doing some VSO work where it is hard for advocates to kind of control their client a little bit because they're in different places and they're a little bit more free range, if you know what I mean. And that free range tends to happen towards the end of a mediation, just when we're trying to sort of pin down some of the agreed upon points. So when dealing with fears, identifying it, realizing it, accepting it, that should be saying refocus on what is positive. There's always got to be one typo. Sorry about that. I did not realize that initially. And think about, you know, what are the steps you'll take to overcome the fear, which creates a sense of empowerment? And perhaps the worst has already occurred. And frankly, in family law circumstances, it often has. If people fear the divorce, where they're already in the filings, they're at the back end of that, they've nearly worked everything out. So, you know, maybe some good things are around the corner. And then similarly with grief, identifying the causes, you know, taking a moment to pause and consider it, you know, validate it, you know, creating an acceptance ritual. I remember when I was a kid, we always had a process whenever we lost a family pet, you know, it was, and as a grown-up, I realized that was an acceptance ritual. So it'll be very context driven. I also think that the methods for high conflict folks work great in online dispute resolution, because being brief, friendly, and informative and firm are all good. Because I think Zoom fatigue makes it hard to be with eye strain for too much time. So if parties are well prepared before they attend, and you try and keep the tone friendly, you always have the option to breakout room. Maybe we should take a break. Would you like to chat with your clients for a few moments? We presented a lot of information. Maybe now is a good time for a break, right? When you're in the middle of your mediation. And you'll notice that the CARS method that Eddie had created for high conflict works great in online dispute resolution. Empathy, relating back to emotional intelligence and resilience and social intelligence works great. Attention relates to that primal empathy, the synchrony, the attunement, being respectful, always a good thought. And also the importance of active listening. We talk and listen at 90 words a minute, but inside we speak to ourselves at 800 words a minute. So we often joke about you're on mute, right? When we can't hear them speaking, but sometimes people are mentally on mute. A party has said something that's very thought-provoking to them, and you see the face on the screen, but the backlighting in the eyes shows that their thoughts are somewhere else. So just keep that in mind. And in general, during mediation and even prior to mediation, you know, mood management, respect, attitudinal management, it helps even before things become an issue that require mediation, and watch out for projections. Some of the great work on high conflict personalities that Eddie and Cloak have done reference how sometimes the high conflict personalities are the people most likely to project their own problems or thought processes on others. This is just some background honoring some of our early adopters of online mediation, like the DCBA program and LA Superior Court's VSO panel, and Susan Guthrie, among others. And I've actually loved it. I love having more time to mediate more because there's no downtime commuting and hunting for parking, especially after they removed some of the parking structures at mosque. It really became a blood sport to find a space. So I'm so glad that that's gone away. And, you know, parties I found are more punctual and they're often more prepared unless they're less tech savvy. And according to the National Academy of Distinguished Neutrals, people's settlement rates are the same online. Whew. I think originally people thought that if we're not nose to nose, we won't be as effective, but it's not necessarily true. Pretty much everyone went online for almost a year and it worked out okay. So I'll let you kind of chew on some of these stats more later, but the key is that it was cheaper with no travel, just as effective. People were better engaged because you could get all the decision makers. You could finally get your insurance adjusters and so forth in the room, or the CEO could hop on near the end, right? Everyone can get there. Their flight wasn't delayed. It might be faster. The lack of personal interaction statistic, I just want to share that piece relates to plaintiff's counsel being concerned if they could not get plaintiff's client in personal injury cases to be visible on screen. It was perceived as less meaningful than being nose to nose. And of course, there's always technical issues. So that was sort of the context. So if it's here to stay, we have to master those filters. Remember the attorney that inadvertently had that cat filter went on when he wasn't intending, but because we're mediators and there's always two sides of the story, maybe it was really cats mediating and the person had inadvertently turned on his lawyer filter by mistake. So I'm going to bring it home with some insights to help you kick butt in the Zoom fatigue category. And people should know that looking close up with just the talking heads, it is a form of close interaction that triggers fight or flight, because we're focused on faces where instead we saw all of people, hopefully, right? And the other thing is that it's like seeing a mirror all day long. Every time I'm videotaping anything, and I'm an online dean, so I'm teaching nightly, I'm always like, oh my God, does my hair really look like that? You know, so I can attest. So, and the other thing is that we're very tethered, you know, so taking frequent breaks will help the parties out, because it turns out that we think better when we're moving. And there's actually research on that. And if you're not sure how you stand with Zoom exhaustion, there's actually a scale that Stanford has put together, so you can kind of see how much it impacts you and get some interactive feedback ways to reduce it. It's also that there's more cognitive load because people are trying to figure out how to unmute and how to do the hand raise gesture and not be rude. And did that person stop speaking because they accidentally hit the mute button, or they dropped from the call and they're outside in the waiting room trying to get back in? Or are they not speaking because they're digesting something that the other party just said, right? So keep those factors in mind. Research has suggested that when people have a lag, other parties automatically assume that that party is less engaged, but it might just be the Wi-Fi slowing down. So we have to sort of consider that. It makes also that risk of speaking over people accidentally a greater pressure. And so the other thing is, when we see our own reactions, it reinforces our own reactions. I don't know how many of you may have been familiar with that. Sandra and Bowman have some great research on that. I was not aware of that, and it makes sense. The other thing is that in video, we don't see posture. We can't see fidgeting, right? So the other thing is we can't see the distance between parties, which often helps you figure out if they're getting closer together. And it's harder to sense if people are leaning in to the discussion or not because of that. So plan on some rapport building ritual at the beginning to kind of do that ice breaking that you would have done in person to recreate that. People that love online meetings, They might have social anxiety. This is a blessing for them. Or if there's DVTROs, in play, things of that nature, this can be great. And the other thing is that the side effects of this are that there are some factors that we over-evaluate that should have no bearing on a mediation that we're no longer subject to being biased about. So height, social dominance, what people are wearing, all that sort of thing, that goes away. So since as mediators, we're responsible for the quality of the mediation experience, I think it's good for us to know this information so we can stay emotionally resilient dealing with, potentially traumatized clients and advocates and ourselves under these circumstances. I like that there's a clock. It helps you kind of keep track at the bottom of the screen as to timing. And the only thing that always bugs me is my fear of, I hope there's nobody in the room that I'm not aware of, that parties haven't disclosed, right? That's my one thing. But we always have the parties do their confidentiality agreement at the front end. Preparation, listening, restraining emotions, even advocates are recommended to do this in general. It works great in ODR. Standing desk can help you counteract the physical aspects of lots of sit time. I'm a judge pro tem and all the judges have them now. So I got to experiment with one for free and I realized I liked it. So it also burns more calories, and with all this sitting, that's a factor. So my last fun slide before we head into questions is the emoticons. You always wondered if they had any sort of impact on the parties. Emoticons pack a punch. There is a research study in the book Nudge about utility customers. And if they were told that they had overutilized their resources, they would try and cut back. If they were told that they were great conservers of energy, they would actually boomerang and use more energy thinking, I got this, right? So they gave part of the group emoticons. And if they gave them a positive emoticon to the people that were great at conserving energy, instead of boomeranging and overcompensating, they sustained and actually kept doing a great job conserving energy. So those emoticons do make a difference. Even though we might not expect that, they do. And that's all I've got. And I think that takes us to 10:45. So we have plenty of time, I hope, for any questions and answers that we might want to go over as a group. Should I maybe do a stop share? Is that better? What do you think, Taisha?
Sure, so we can see everyone's faces.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dean Liberio. Everyone really enjoyed the presentation. We got some really positive comments in the chat about some of these nuggets that people can take with them. Does anyone have any questions? We have a smallish group, so feel free to just jump right in.
I don't really have any, this is Richard, and I don't really have any questions, Lydia, but the nuggets were just fascinating. I mean, I was sitting there listening to this and going through and I was just going, oh yeah, what about that? Yes, I've experienced that. Oh, I need to do this. So I'm gonna go back through this recording actually. There's things in here that just hit me just up the side of the head. So Lydia, thank you. I need to go back and just actually listen to this again.
I'm glad it had some good high notes. I gotta tell you, a lot of the stuff about Zoom fatigue, I've been battling that because I've been subbing for faculty and then I was traveling. I was, dealing with honor council meetings and stuff for 2 weeks all across the East Coast. And I was feeling that fatigue. And as I did more research, there were about 15 studies that were really great. And I was like, I don't want to overwhelm people. Let me pick my top 3. Okay, maybe 5. There's a growing body of research about this, which I think is kind of fascinating because everybody's dealing with this. And I don't mean to pick on Zoom because I wouldn't be able to survive without it. It also relates to all the different, any online platform more generally.
No,
I think Karina might have a question too. I see a hand up, but I
Yes, so Karina has her hand up.
Would you like to go ahead and ask it verbally?
Sure, if nobody else wants to break the ice. Yes, hello again. We met last week. It
It's the
seems
BHBA inclusion, no,
yeah,
outreach.
yes,
Yes.
yeah, it's good to see you again. I was like, oh, I know you.
It's so
Um,
great to see everyone on this, call. Jan was one of my SCMA mentors. Andy and I have worked together a lot at Downey and Bellflower and Moss. Professor Pollack did a great job introducing me to the ethics of mediation at USC. I have been at PDG groups with Sid, Jan, and I have worked together on the LA Lawyer Journal. I enjoy working with Karina at BHBA. It's just a wonderful community of friends and colleagues here. So I'm really enjoying seeing everyone. If anyone has any pointers they want to share of things that they've tried that work, this might be a great time to share those as well, because I know this is, like I said, just the tip of the iceberg. So
if I
Did
may,
Karina have a question?
yes, I do. Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, so it's a little bit, I'm going to take from what you said and I want to push it into a direction that I've been thinking over the summer because I was traveling. So you made a presentation about the three colors, the red, the blue, and the green. And to be honest, I always have this reluctance. I know I'm a neuroscientist at the origin of my training. And, there is a
Awesome.
yeah, I have a wild, I'm an overeducated, I wonder why is that used for, but, and speaking of labels, I know it's important for all of us to have a common language and kind of be able to hit certain points very fast, hence we have red, blue, green. But in practice, what I've noticed this summer, and I'm curious, because it's such a great group of people here, and especially, what you said, I want to hear from many perspectives, ideally, what you think. So I traveled, and there were many issues like booking a flight. I had like 3 flights to Rome canceled, like with 2 months ahead of time, and they were like, "Oh, it's because of the pandemic." And I had to, troubleshoot a lot of conflicts, basically. And one of the things that I remarked is that people were somehow trained in dispute resolution, right? You have an operator from India who would try his best, but it's mechanical, like super mechanical. And you can hear, we're trained, so you can hear the script behind the words, and they're unable to actually internalize it and transform it. So they can interact on a human level. They say the script, and that's why I'm going back to red, blue, green, because it's great to identify, but how do we kind of help people, especially, an operator somewhere in a different part of the world, to actually be effective? This is, I'm very curious, and I want to throw this out, and if you want to pick it up, I'm so curious to hear what you think, because it's so interesting to have these labels, but in the same time, even in mediation, I witnessed some when people become controlling and mechanical instead of fluid. And I wonder if you have any comments or insights about this.
Yeah, and I would just say to give the folks behind the SDI inventory their due. It's actually 2 big books, and that original triangle, it's got a lot of the cuspy with the blue greens and the red blues and the green hubs. And so to your point, there's a lot of nuances. I just wanted to introduce the notion of the fact that there can be personality, motivational factors that weigh in aside from a high conflict personality or additional layers of event-driven trauma such as a pandemic versus, you know, some of the emotional intelligence and social intelligence. So your point is really well taken, and it's something really worth studying. We spent several days working on it in the leadership program because we were going through how to handle it in real life hypothetical situations. It was a fascinating workshop, which could be its own presentation. But yeah, that is a good point. It's not the only answer or solution to something, but I think it does show that there are different points of departure that people are starting from. And unless we appreciate some of those, it might take us longer to figure out roughly where they're coming from. Because some of the work that we do, like for example, prior to COVID, I would do LA Superior Court family mediations. And I know many of the people on this call have probably done some of that as well. And if the other mediator calls out sick, the other volunteer, and you look down the hallway and you see you've got 4 families to help and you've got 7.5 hours, you're going to have to kind of take some shortcuts heuristically here and there. It's a little bit different than maybe an all-day employment mediation, you know, over emotional, but less emotional than family law kinds of issues for EEOC or DEFA type purposes. Because I noticed there, the parties, they have certain concerns, but sometimes the people that show up are a division head that maybe wasn't in contact with the employee in particular, you know, that sort of thing. So they're a little bit more reined in than some other circumstances.
Lydia, I loved when you said yes doesn't always mean yes. That so resonated for me. I remember teaching mediation skills to judges in India 16 years ago. And I landed the day before and, you know, popped up the next morning completely in, you know, time discombobulated, right? And I start that morning off and we get to like the mid-morning break or the lunch break. And I turned to my colleague who had been on the ground there for 4 months. And I said, wow, this seems like it's going great. I mean, they're agreeing with everything I said. He said, well, no, Lee J, they actually have to say yes, because in their society, teachers are held at a higher social regard than judges. And so because you're a teacher, they need to agree with everything you say, whether they actually do or not. And I thought, okay, I have no social intelligence here.
Oh, well, I don't know that that's true. That's a very subtle point, but there is, if it's a Hindu Brahmin pecking order, that is the case, because my boyfriend through my first master's and my JD happened to be Indian, Southeast Asian Indian for clarity. And so for 8 years, I got to know the family members well. And his grandfather was the Chief Justice of the Indian Supreme Court. His last name was Subramaniam, and it's kind of an interesting story. And the other grandfather was President Geary from 1967 to 1971. We met at UC Irvine. We were just classmates and so on. But I learned a lot about that one culture just because of the degree of interaction and our travels, taking turns visiting back and forth. And the thing that baffled me that I could not figure out, to your point, and so it's easy to get confused, is there is a body language sort of like a tilting head action. And I was like, what does that mean? Yes, no, maybe, or something else I haven't even thought of, you know. So it's always fun because it introduces these new things, but also yes, it's often related to acknowledging the speaker. Because most of my career in-house, I was first at a Japanese company under Matsushita, and then over at Formosa Plastics, JM Eagle subsidiary. And initially I couldn't figure out why everyone kept asking me if I'd eaten. And I was like, do I look hungry? I mean, I was skinnier then, maybe that's why, but I didn't realize it was a cultural thing. And I was like, is there a right or a wrong answer? What is the right or the wrong answer? If I say no, are we going to lunch? You know, and that's imposing on the other party. If they were offering and I say, you know, no, am I being inconsiderate? So there's a lot there. You know, it's very easy to misinterpret anybody. It happens to everybody. The more you know, the better off you are. But there's just still so much to know.
Clearly, you should have been there instead of me.
sure you handled it better than I could have, so.
Can I make a comment in here? One of the things that contributes to conflict and to all the things that we deal with as mediators is how people, it's related to a sense of resiliency, is where does this stress come from? And there's some interesting work. You've mentioned a couple of assessments. There's an assessment I use with some of my coaching clients a lot, and it's called the Stress Resiliency Profile. It defines stress as, we define stress as something external. The deadline is crazy, or there's way too much work, or this kind of thing really pushes my buttons. But this profile is about the internal concepts of stress that drive us to be in a stress situation. So for example, the internal principles we have might be something about, oh my God, it's always all my fault and I have to do it right now and I don't know what I'm going to do and I've got to do it myself and it's got to be perfect. Or it's somehow not recognizing our own abilities. So we say, well, I don't know that I'm good enough for this. I can't do it, then you get all worried about it. But sometimes if you understand stress as being both internally and externally driven, sometimes you can hear that in what people say as you talk about something. So it's a little pushy to say, where did you get that idea about why you have to do everything on your own? But if you reframe it and are gentler about it, you can actually explore that and help people identify and come to terms with their own stress and maybe rethink it a little bit. What would happen realistically? What would happen if you didn't do everything? Where does those ideas come from? How does that develop over time for you? Does it work? Is that something that people say to you over and over again? But this idea that stress is actually an internal perception of things as opposed to an external driver is something that I found extremely useful in talking to people about.
That's a great insight. That happens to me all the time in academic advising, or if there's conflict about a grade and, going back and forth in petitions and so forth, because the first thing students always, if they struggle with their first law school class, they always start out with, I've always been an A student.
Right.
And I have a lot of MDs and even people from other fields that have done amazing things that I can only dream about doing. And it's sort of like, but this is a different ball of wax. It's a different subject matter. And that's usually when some of those internal stressors start to kind of come out in dribs and drabs.
Right.
Well, I'm a perfectionist. Getting a B is not acceptable to me. What do you mean I didn't pass my, so I totally relate to that. That is a good point. Not all of it is reactive.
You've mentioned a couple of assessments. The one that I'm referring to is called the Stress Resiliency Profile. And it's published by CPP, the folks who do the Myers-Briggs Consulting Psychologist Press. And it's inexpensive, it's quick and easy. It's something that goes over really well because it's not the Myers-Briggs. You don't have 140 questions you have to answer. But this one you can do in 10 minutes and it's no big deal. And it comes with a lot of information that the client can get, or the person who's taking it can get, that they can read on their own. So confidentiality is maintained as well because they get all of the information and the debriefs in that booklet. So that the result, you don't have to ask them what the results are. You just talk about some things that they learned. That's very helpful because then you're not asking them to divulge very personal information that maybe they're not so sure they want to.
I hate to cut this robust discussion off, but we are at the end of the hour and I believe we have another session back to back. So please join me in thanking Lydia and let's give her a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. It was very thought-provoking and your slides are very rich in content and I'm sure people can look back at them and delve deeper. But thank you again so much. This was a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure. And thanks, Maria. I'm going to look that up. That sounds like fun. All right.
It certainly helped me. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.